Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Garrett Malee. I'm the Executive Director of CanConnect19, and I want to begin by acknowledging why so many people are joining us tonight. The health of many Canadians has been severely and negatively impacted by COVID vaccine injury and long COVID. For many, these impacts are not abstract or temporary, they're ongoing, life-altering, and deeply destabilizing. We are seeing serious effects across multiple body systems, including severe neurological challenges such as brain fog, tingling, burning sensations, cardiovascular issues, including myocarditis, blood clots, and related disorders, respiratory distress marked by a significant reduction in normal breathing function, and widespread systemic inflammation, including nerve and joint pain. What makes this especially difficult is that these symptoms are often interacted with one another. Instead of systems working together to support healing, the body can feel like it's fighting itself. The result is not only physical disability, but emotional strain, uncertainty, and isolation. At CanConnect19, our role is not to oversimplify these experiences or offer quick fixes. Our role is to create an informed community where people can learn, ask questions, and explore approaches that prioritize caution, physiology, and long-term health. That commitment is also reflected in our partnership with CC TeleHealth. Together, we offer a 12-month post-COVID recovery and care program designed to support the restoration of core health and system function to the best of the body's ability. For qualified CanConnect19 members, a bursary is available to help reduce financial barriers to accessing this care. Anyone interested can contact info@canconnect19.ca, and I'll put that email in the chat in a moment for more information and to apply. So tonight's presentation, I believe, fits squarely within that philosophy, informed, measured, and focused on minimizing harm while supporting the body's natural capacity to heal. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter and speaker this evening, Dr. Wendi Roscoe. Many of you recognize her, many of you have probably met her before. But Dr. Wendi is a researcher and educator with a focus on metabolic health, mineral balance, and environmental toxicology. Her work emphasizes a physiology-first approach to detoxification, helping people understand not only what may be contributing to ongoing symptoms, but also why certain interventions can unintentionally make things worse. In this session, Wendi will walk us through how heavy metals and halides affect the body, the critical differences between chelation, Wendi, you can correct me if I'm wrong there, and binding strategies, and how detoxification can be approached in a way that prioritizes safety, mineral balance, and system stability. So we're very grateful to have Wendi with us tonight, and we appreciate her willingness to, share this knowledge and information with our community. So Wendi, I will pass the floor over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So tonight's talk, I'm going to be focusing on the metals that I think are the most important, that we have the most exposure to, that are the most likely to be an issue. Um, I'm also going to talk about minerals. And so, like the way that this sort of relates to vaccine injury, a lot of people with vaccine injury have a lot of similar symptoms to metal exposure. And so, there's a bit of an overlap here. So, I'm going to focus mostly on the metals and the minerals, but I also want to kind of clarify that there isn't really ever like like a magic pill or supplement that's going to help us get rid of toxins and get rid of metals. There's always like pros and cons to everything. So I'm going to talk about, so I'm going to share my screen and I'll show you my overview. This is actually a humongous topic. And so I've tried to narrow it down and I want to talk about where different heavy metals are in your body. I want to talk about how would you feel if you had high amounts of metals in certain parts of your body? Because we live on planet Earth, so we're going to have some. We're always going to have trace amounts of lead and cadmium and arsenic and mercury and those kinds of things. And so, how do we know when it's an issue? And how do we know when it's like a physiological level that we can deal with? And then I want to talk about like the forms of the metals because there's some forms of different metals that are toxic and some that are nutritionally essential. And so we have to kind of differentiate. We can't just assume anything that's a metal is bad, right? And then I'm gonna talk about the various metal chelators and binders that are the most discussed in the COVID world. Um, that's applicable to everyone. It's just that it seems that vaccine injured people have a higher interest in chelating metals. And then how do we test for it? So this is actually a super tricky topic. And then I want to talk about avoiding exposure because that's probably the number one thing that we can do. And sometimes that's not easy, but I'm going to show you all kinds of interesting things. And then stimulating natural detox pathways, which I won't be able to, in this presentation, be able to dive deeply into, but I have talked about this topic in other videos. And Garrett can maybe put the link into our like Rumble channel. I've talked about autophagy and all kinds of things in other videos. So if we look at where different metals are in our body, different metals are going to potentially accumulate or have their effects in different tissues in the body in different ways. So, lead, for example, is most highly going to accumulate in bones and teeth. And then also, it can impact the kidneys and the brain. So, the parts that I have highlighted are the areas that where the metals are most likely to accumulate. But there's other places that they can go as well. So mercury is primarily about the brain and the nervous system, but also the connective tissue. And then you can also have mercury that accumulates in the kidneys, the liver, the endocrine glands, and also in the placenta and the fetus. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some chemistry. Which hopefully isn't too overwhelming, but it's important to understand that there's different forms of different metals and minerals actually, and they have different effects based on the form that they're in. So we can't just assume like all of something is terrible. There are some metals that all of them are terrible, and I'll tell you about those. So cadmium is primarily going to impact the kidneys, but you will also find some in the liver and the bones. Arsenic is mostly going to affect the liver, but it can also affect kidneys, skin, hair, and nails. And I'll show you a picture of what nails can look like if you have some arsenic accumulating. Aluminum is pretty much going to affect mostly your brain, but it can also impact your bones, liver, and lungs. Nickel is going to affect the liver, the kidneys, and the skin. Mostly nickel. So there's two forms of nickel, which I'll talk about. But most of the nickel that we're in contact with on a regular basis as a regular person is allergic reactions. And then there's chromium. And chromium, there's two different forms. There's the nutritional chromium that we need to have as a supplement, it helps us regulate blood sugar. It's really important. And then there's chromium 6, which affects the liver, the kidneys, and the lungs. So these are the primary metals that I'm going to talk about that are not good for us and where they accumulate. So, how would you feel if you had high levels of these? So, what I've done is I've put each what because this is going to be a lot of information to remember. So, let's think about lead, for example, bone and neurology. So, like your bones and your brain are going to the primary places where you're going to notice lead if you have lead accumulation. So you're going to have bone and joint pain. You're going to have fatigue, brain fog, irritability. It'll affect your mood. You can have headaches, neuropathy, hypertension. It can affect your blood pressure. It can affect cardiovascular system. But really, if you're thinking about any symptoms that you have, like don't do the like, oh my gosh, I have everything that because lots of symptoms can be lots of different things. But bone and neurology is about lead. If we think about mercury, this is about your nervous system and your emotional and endocrine kind of systems. So brain fog, memory issue, anxiety, irritability, sleep issues, neuropathy, headaches, hormone stuff, sensitivities, and then like immune dysregulation. Those are going to be things that are going to happen with mercury exposure. Cadmium is going to affect primarily your kidneys and your bones. I lost my mouse. There we go. Kidneys and bones. So things like chronic fatigue, decreasing kidney function. So you can look at your kidney function. If you do regular blood work, you should do blood work like at least once a year anyways, just to see what's going on with all kinds of things. But if you're going to look at kidney function, you want to look at what's called GFR, which is your glomerular filtration rate. If you say GFR to your doctor, they'll know what that is. And creatinine. And those two things look at your kidney function. If your kidney function is declining, that is a sign of potential cadmium exposure. Chronic fatigue, bone pain, osteoporosis, osteopenia, muscle weakness, and anemia and cardiovascular stuff. Arsenic is about the skin, your gut, your gastrointestinal system, and your nerves. So having, nausea and diarrhea, abdominal pain, those kinds of things, hair and nail changes. So this picture up here, so everybody look at your fingernails and see if you have these lines, these horizontal lines on your fingernails. That is a classic sign of too much arsenic exposure. If you have white spots, that's not the same thing. White spots can mean that you have low zinc. But if you have white lines, then that can mean that you have arsenic. So if you have a lot of aluminum exposure, basically that's all about your cognitive function. So this is going to be things like brain fog and memory issues, not being able to like problem solve and think and learn and remember. But it can also affect your muscles, your bones, and your inflammatory system. Nickel is about skin and gut, mostly skin. So most of the time, so there's two forms of nickel that I'll talk about. The main form that we're mostly exposed to will be contact dermatitis kind of things. You'll have skin issues when nickel touches your skin. So sometimes if you have like piercings or jewelry or like watches or necklaces that contain nickel and you get rashes where that is, like here, this person wearing a watch, and then exactly where the watch goes, they have a rash, then that is a nickel kind of allergy. But it's not really like a toxic exposure as much as your body being sensitive to nickel. A lot of people are sensitive to nickel. And then chromium is the last one, and this is basically about skin and lungs. So you can have skin rashes and skin ulcers, but also like lots of respiratory stuff, respiratory irritation, cough, and then it can also affect kidneys. So those are kind of some of the main symptoms that would go with the different kinds of metals. So now, which things are toxic depend on the chemical form. So this is just a tiny bit of chemistry. And the ones on this screen all are completely toxic. Lead, mercury, and cadmium. There are no forms that are nutritional or beneficial. All mercury, all lead, all cadmium, all toxic. So we don't ever want any of these in any form. So lead is mostly in compound form. So it's usually like if we're looking at lead paint or lead pipes or like that kind of exposure, it's either lead carbonate or lead chromate, all toxic. There's no amount of lead exposure that is good. Mercury can be in a bunch of different forms. So we can have elemental, which is just like the atom. It's not in an ion form. Like when we look at our minerals, a lot of minerals have to be in an ion form. So it has to have a charge for us to absorb it and use it in our cells. And so any element is like by itself with no charge is usually not usable by the body, but we can be exposed to elemental mercury, or we can be exposed to inorganic mercury, which can have either a 1+ charge or a 2+ charge. The most common forms of mercury exposure, though, are organic forms. And organic just means that it came from living things. It doesn't mean that it's good. When we're buying groceries, organic means good, but organic in chemistry terms doesn't always mean good. So there's methyl mercury and ethyl mercury. And both of those forms I'm going to talk about in just a little bit more detail in a second. But basically, methyl mercury is worse than ethyl mercury, but they're both bad. We don't want any mercury ever. Mercury is definitely not good for our brain and nervous system. And then cadmium is usually a 2+ ion form, but it also forms compounds like cadmium oxides or cadmium chlorides, and they're all toxic forms. When we look at nickel, nickel can be a metal, which is very, very toxic. Most people are not exposed to this, but if you have an occupation where you're welding or you're working in battery manufacturing, then you can be exposed to the metal of nickel, which is very, very toxic, and you don't want to do that. If we're looking at like most of our normal exposure from jewelry and some kinds of stainless steel cookware might have some nickel, then that is going to be a soluble salt form of nickel. And then usually the most issue is going to be an allergic reaction. So most nickel with contact to our skin doesn't affect everyone, but it can affect some people that are sensitive to it. Then when we look at arsenic, so arsenic is usually found as a compound. So it's usually as an oxide, an acid, or a salt. And we have inorganic forms and we have organic forms. So the inorganic forms are the toxic forms. And the organic form, which is found in seafood, is not toxic. So, but the kind of arsenic that is in rice is toxic. So brown rice has more arsenic than white rice, the toxic form. So we want to be careful with rice. And I'll talk a bit more about that as well. So when we look at like arsenic 3 or 5, the difference is basically here, and this is just chemistry, just so you know, it's just a tiny little difference. Arsenic 3, arsenite, is an ion where the oxygen has a negative charge, whereas arsenic 5 has a double bond with an oxygen and it's not an ion form. And so very tiny differences in these molecules can make it either fine or not fine. Actually, both of these forms of arsenic are not fine. We don't want either of these in our body. And then we look at aluminum. So aluminum is usually found as compounds, so usually as salts, oxides, or hydroxides. So aluminum is often found in groundwater, so it can be taken up by plants, but it's also in all kinds of other things. And at the end, I'm gonna talk about more details about how to avoid exposure. But antacids, cookware, those kinds of things are toxic at high doses. Now, what is a high dose? I mean, there is no biological use for aluminum at all. So I think that we want to minimize exposure because there's no benefit to any amount of aluminum. And then when we look at the insoluble forms, then we have like aluminosilicates. Aluminosilicates are natural and actually pretty wonderful, and these are not toxic. And we find these things in zeolite and bentonite clay, which I'll talk a little bit about those. And then the last main one is chromium. Chromium 6 is highly toxic, and chromium 3 is an essential mineral. So we can have good and bad forms, right? So I wanted to go through that because I don't want you to think like all of every metal is bad, right? Sometimes there's good forms and sometimes there's different forms, but none of them are good. So when we look at how can we deal with these? Okay, so I want to just take a second. There's a bunch of different chelators and binders. So a chelator is something that can attach to a metal and kind of grab onto it and pull it out of your tissues. And it can go into the blood, but it can redistribute. There's different ways that metals can affect our cells, and it depends on where they're located and what tissues they're in. So when we think about like where metals are, so I talked about, they can be in our brain, they can be in our bones and our kidneys and our skin. Sometimes they're in the blood and sometimes they're in the fluid that surrounds our cells. So that's the extracellular fluid or the interstitial fluid. And then sometimes they can be inside of our cells. So when metals are inside of our cells, there's actually nothing we can do about that. So none of these things, EDTA and DMSA and all the things I'm going to talk about, none of these can actually go inside of our cells and get metals and pull them out and make our body excrete them. And also, with each of these things that can chelate metals, some of them can also bind and chelate minerals, which we don't want to get rid of. And so it becomes a bit of a pros and cons. Like there's benefits, but then there's also risks. Okay, so the first one that I want to talk about is EDTA. So this is one of the most common ones. This is most commonly used in the IV form when people have lead poisoning, which is hopefully less now that leaded paint and leaded gas and all of that, lead pipes, all of those things are not, common anymore unless you live in an old building or work in an environment where there's still lead paint and pipes. So EDTA is really good at binding lead, cadmium, mercury in the 2 plus form, and aluminum. So that's awesome. It can absorb into our blood. So if we do this IV, it's directly in the blood. It can go into the tissues. It can go into the extracellular fluid, and it can bind to these metals. And then we have to get it out of those tissues and we have to help it get to our detoxification pathways. So usually it'll go back into the blood from the tissues, and then from the blood, it has to either go to the kidneys to be peed out, or it has to go to the liver, and then the liver puts it into the bile that goes into the digestive tract, and then we poop it out, right? So peeing and pooping are the primary ways that we get rid of stuff. But the problem is that it can also bind to minerals that we don't want to get rid of. It can bind to calcium, magnesium, zinc, and copper because EDTA just recognizes ions that have either a 2 plus or a 3 plus charge. So divalent is a 2 plus and trivalent is a 3 plus. And it will bind using these hydroxyl groups on the molecule. So this is what the molecule looks like. And so we need to be careful that we're not getting rid of minerals. Like if we don't have high metals, if we don't actually have a lot of lead, cadmium, mercury, and aluminum in our body, then if you did use EDTA, then you would end up getting rid of minerals. And then that's going to cause a problem. So most commonly, EDTA has been used for lead poisoning. And then you would go to a hospital, they would hook you up to an IV, they would monitor you very closely, and then you would replace the minerals so that you don't become mineral deficient. And even that, like once you start chelating minerals, you can't just like take a mineral and then just replace it because minerals have to get into the tissues and into the organelles and they have to get into places. It's not as simple as just taking a supplement and then it's magically in the body where it needs to be. So if you deplete your minerals, it's not super simple to get your minerals back. It can take weeks to replace minerals if you deplete yourself of minerals. And then if we use oral EDTA, about 2 to 5% of it will absorb into the blood, which means it can pull those metals out of tissues and the extracellular fluid and the blood. And the rest of it is going to stay in the gut and it will act like a binder. So a binder is something that stays in the gut and doesn't go into your blood. And so remember, our liver is one of our primary detoxification organs, and the liver is going to put those metals into the bile. Your liver makes bile. The bile goes to the gallbladder. The gallbladder stores the bile until you eat a meal that has fat in it, healthy fat. Don't eat bad fat. So when you have healthy fat in your digestive tract, the gallbladder contracts and releases the bile. So the bile has two main functions. One is to help you digest fat, and one is to get rid of liver waste. And so then when the gallbladder contracts and that bile is in the small intestine, we want to make sure we're having regular bowel movements so that we're excreting that waste that's coming from the liver. Because if you're constipated and you're not pooping every day, then those metals, any waste that the liver is putting in the bile, that can just be reabsorbed back into your blood. So, one of the number one things about detoxifying is to make sure your digestive system is working really well. You want to be having regular bowel movements so that you're getting rid of the stuff the liver is trying to get rid of. So, the percent of the EDTA that absorbs, it can chelate metals in the blood and the extracellular fluid, but none of these things can chelate metals inside of cells, inside your brain or inside your bones, where, most of the mercury and lead and that stuff is. So it can get the metals that are in the extracellular fluid or in the blood. And the way that we get bone and brain metals into the blood and the extracellular fluid is through autophagy, like normal cell turnover. Like when cells die and they break down, then all of those waste products go into the blood. That's when we can chelate things. And bone doesn't really turn over very quickly. It takes like 7 years for bone cells to turn over. Um, and a lot of neurons they don't replicate. So things can stay in the brain for much longer. So the problem is that EDTA can also bind our minerals. And the main minerals that EDTA can bind to is calcium, zinc, copper, and magnesium. So if you have digestive malabsorption issues, if you have leaky gut, if your intestinal lining is damaged, that usually actually also indicates that your blood-brain barrier is damaged. And I wouldn't use EDTA because then you're going to have more inflammation, you're going to have more mineral depletion, and it you have to figure out what is the metal risk versus the losing minerals risk. So the next one is DMSA, dimercaptosuccinate acid. And this one binds to metals in a different way. So it's going to use the sulfhydryl groups. And this is going to be really good for binding to lead, cadmium, mercury, and arsenic. But it's also going to bind some of our good minerals. It'll bind some aluminum, some nickel, and some chromium, the toxic kind. Chromium 6 is the toxic kind, 3 is the good kind. It'll bind to the toxic kind, but it will also bind to copper, zinc, magnesium, and selenium. And so it uses a different mechanism and it binds slightly different metals and minerals. DMSA is most commonly used as like a urine provoking. So you take DMSA, then you look at your urine before and after to see what kind of metals are being pulled that you're excreting. And usually you test every hour for about 6 hours afterwards, and then you look at the amount of metals that are being excreted. And then it gives you a rough idea of how many metals are potentially in your body. So you need to think about DMSA can't get into your cells. So when you have things like lead in your bones and mercury in your brain and aluminum in your brain tissues, and that is not in the blood or the extracellular fluid, EDTA or DMSA can't access the metals that are inside of cells. It can only access the metals that are in the fluid around the cells or in your blood. And so sometimes this can overestimate the amount of toxicity that you have because it'll take whatever is in the extracellular fluid in the blood and send it to the kidneys and you'll pee it out and it'll look like a lot. But without the DMSA, you would have likely peed that out over a few days, whereas the DMSA is making you pee out a lot all at once. So it's an indication of what is in the extracellular fluid in the blood, but it's not an indication of what's in the tissues because we can never access that. So that's what makes this whole thing very difficult. So we all have trace amounts of metals because we live on planet Earth and we eat food that grows in the soil, that has groundwater, and we breathe air, right? And so there's a certain amount that we're always going to have. But there are places where we get extra exposure that we don't need, and I'll talk about those. When we have these trace metals and minerals, they can bind proteins and enzymes. They can get into the cells. They can mess up mitochondria, which are the organelles that make energy. And they can bind to lipids and they can bind to all kinds of things. And they can cause all those symptoms that I talked about in the beginning. And when we chelate them, where we use EDTA or DMSA, where it binds to the metals inside our body, then we have a risk also of redistributing them. So we can end up mobilizing metals and putting them into our circulation, making them kind of go around the whole body to be taken up by other cells and other tissues. So just because we can chelate them, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to pee it out or put it in the bile and poop it out. So redistribution is a risk. Sometimes metals like lead being in your bones, it's just kind of sitting there, like having a box in the attic. It's not doing anything. I mean, too much of it would. You don't want to have boxes falling down the stairs, but a certain amount just kind of sitting there isn't necessarily doing anything. But if you start pulling it out and pulling it apart and making it flow all around your body, then it can actually kind of stir it up and make things worse. So when we look at how we naturally get rid of things, we're primarily using our liver and our kidneys. We sweat out a lot of toxins, including metals, and breathing. We can breathe out stuff. I don't think we breathe off very many metals, but I mean, actually, mercury can be a vapor. So if you have mercury fillings, you can breathe that. And so we have about, anywhere from 1 to 5 milligrams of lead in our bones all the time. And do we want to disturb it or is it okay where it is? So we have to kind of think about that. When we think about chelating metals or metal detoxification, we also have to think about minerals because all of these things will also bind to minerals, and we don't want to deplete minerals. Minerals are extremely important for all cellular functions. Like even like magnesium has like 300 functions. Zinc and copper and calcium and potassium. Like all of these minerals are extremely important for all of our tissues and all of our cells. And so if we start pulling those out of our body, we could probably cause more harm than good, depending on how much metal we have in our body. It's all about how to know if you're high risk or not. So different minerals are going to bind to different proteins and enzymes. We store minerals in our bones, in our muscles, in our liver. They're inside mitochondria, they're inside of our lysosomes, and they have all of these different physiological functions. And so if you think about doing like a blood test, you're like, okay, so well, I'll just get a blood test and I'll just see how much zinc I have in my body, how much magnesium or calcium. And to a point, a blood test can tell you something, but it doesn't tell you how much is in the tissue. Your blood levels can look normal, but it doesn't mean that it's normal in the tissue where the minerals are supposed to be, because we can't measure the amount of minerals in our tissues. If we have chronic stress and if we have oxidative stress, so oxidative stress is when we're exposed to toxic things, or if we have a lot of inflammation, then we actually decrease mineral transport. So mineral transport, when we eat minerals, we're not going to absorb as much. If we have stress, emotional stress, physical stress, pain, not sleeping, those things, we're not going to absorb as many minerals as we're supposed to. And then once the minerals are in the blood, we won't be able to transport them into our cells. So certain people, especially vaccine injured, that have a lot of oxidative stress, they're already having difficulty getting minerals into their cells. And so I think that chelating, trying to detox metals can be very risky. So a little bit of a note about mercury. So when we think about mercury fillings, the problem with mercury in our fillings, so it's mercury metal. It's not the ion form. It's the um, molecular form. And we have mercury issues because we're actually breathing mercury vapors. And so we increase the release of mercury every time we chew, grind our teeth, have hot drinks, brush our teeth. There should be an H in there. And then we're going to inhale those mercury vapors. And then that gets into the bloodstream, and then it can get into our brain and cause a problem. So mercury binds to sulfur groups or thiol groups, and we have a lot of sulfur groups in mitochondria that makes our energy, and it can accumulate in the kidneys, liver, mostly our brain, but also the connective tissue. We have a lot of sulfur-rich groups in our connective tissue. And this will be worse if we have a lot of oxidative stress. And so we have to think about, do we want to remove those fillings? Removing fillings, this is such a debate. And actually, throw in the chat, I'm curious, do you have mercury fillings? Have you had them removed? Would you think about removing them? I'm just curious how much mercury fillings are still out there. And removing them can be really risky. So you can release more mercury in 1 hour, getting a filling removed not properly, than many years of just the passive little tiny bits that's released. So this is a really good question. Do you remove them? So if you do want to remove your mercury fillings, you really have to make sure that you go to a dentist that specializes in removing mercury fillings. You can't just drill them out, and you're going to create such a massive amount of exposure. So you have to be very careful when you do this. So there's no chelation process that can get rid of mercury or any metals that are inside of the cells of your tissues. So when we do have mercury in our brain, it will release slowly over time. And this is kind of the ideal way to do it. As we have autophagy and as like, which is, cells breaking down, cell turnover, which happens naturally with some intermittent fasting, then we're going to naturally, gradually, slowly break down this stuff and get rid of it. So the key is to not keep being exposed to more than your body can deal with. So the next one I want to talk about is zeolite. So zeolite, so here's an example of a aluminum molecule that is actually not bad. So this is an aluminosilicate, and this is a lattice structure that is negatively charged, and it does not go into your blood. So this is going to stay in your GI tract, in your gastrointestinal tract. And most zeolite, or a lot of zeolite, is in the form of a spray, and so that's actually you're swallowing it. Like it's not going into your blood. Zeolite, these molecules are huge. They can't go into your blood. So they're staying in the GI tract and they're acting more like a binder. So it does not dissolve, it does not enter circulation, it can't go into your cells. So this is good for binding metals in your gut that come either from your food or your water or the bile where your liver is getting rid of stuff and putting it in the bile, and then that goes into your GI tract. So zeolite is really great for lead, cadmium, nickel, mercury, and aluminum. Once it gets to the liver and it gets into the bile, goes into your GI tract. And it also can bind ammonium, mycotoxins, and histamine. So often people feel better quickly with using zeolite because of these effects. And so zeolite, I would say, is very mild compared to EDTA and DMSA. So these can bind some minerals, magnesium, zinc, copper, and calcium, but significantly less than EDTA or DMSA. So I would say zeolite is safer. It'll take longer, but you're not going to be as mineral depleted. You're not as likely to redistribute metals to a bunch of different tissues. And then we have humic and fulvic acid. So this one is interesting too because this is actually great for our soil. So humic acid is a big, huge, giant molecule, and fulvic acid is a smaller molecule. So basically, humic acid is going to bind to metals and prevent them from being absorbed. So if we took this as a supplement, it would stay in our gut and it would bind stuff, kind of like zeolite, and it wouldn't let things absorb into our blood. Whereas fulvic acid can absorb into our blood because it's small, so we can chelate things in our blood and the extracellular fluid. Humic and fulvic acid is made naturally all the time. So it's in soil and it's in compost. So if you compost, you're making humic acid and fulvic acid, and this is really great to add to your garden. So if you grow food, you want to compost, right? Put all of your old plant matter and, carrot tops and potato peels and everything else. You want to compost that and then put it in your garden because it's going to contain humic and fulvic acid, and that's excellent for plants because humic is going to bind to minerals in the soil and make them bioavailable for plants. It helps to hold water in the soil. It helps to support the microorganisms in the soil, and it's good for drainage and aeration. And it can bind heavy metals, and then the plant doesn't take up heavy metals. So humic acid in our garden is excellent because then our plant foods like our carrots and potatoes and our beets and Swiss chard aren't going to have heavy metals in them because the humic acid is going to bind them and prevent the plants from taking them up. So Very excellent for plants. Fulvic acid is really cool because it actually helps move minerals into the plants. So humic acid binds the metals, prevents the plants from taking them up. Fulvic acid brings the minerals in. So these two things are excellent for the garden. So it's going to bind to the trace minerals like zinc and copper and magnesium and manganese and iron and calcium and all of these wonderful things that we want our plant foods to take up. And it also stimulates root growth. It's great for microorganisms. And then the humic acid blocks the metals. So these are like, so just compost stuff and put it in your garden. It's like absolutely the most wonderful thing you can do if you're growing your own food. Now, what happens if we take it as a supplement? Because a lot of people take humic and fulvic acid as a supplement to detoxify. And this depends on the amount of metals that you have in your body versus, if you're low in metals, you might lose minerals, but if you have high metals, it can help. So it depends on the ratio of what's going on with you. So humic acid has many, many different binding sites. It's this huge giant molecule. There's actually multiple humic acid molecules. It's not just one thing. But in our body, if we took this as a supplement, it acts like a binder. It will bind metals in the gut, just like zeolite, but probably stronger than zeolite. Zeolite is, I would say, quite mild, whereas humic acid would be a bit better. And rather than being like a rigid structure, it's more of a flexible organic kind of molecule, and it can bind in your gut. So again, think about if you're doing some intermittent fasting and you're helping your body to normally detoxify, your liver is picking stuff up, putting it in the bile, putting that in your gastrointestinal tract. That's where we have the biggest possibility of getting rid of metals in our body. So then humic acid will bind to lead, cadmium, mercury, nickel, aluminum, and the toxic chromium. So that's really good. And it won't go into our blood. It won't redistribute or mobilize metals. It'll just bind them in the gut and then you poop it out. Eat some fiber, drink lots of water, and then out it goes. So that would be really excellent. Humic acid can also bind to some pesticides and herbicides and dioxins, which is really good, and some plastic, which, the earth is too full of plastic. It can also bind to some minerals. So you don't want to do this for a long time, right? It is definitely more gentle than EDTA or DMSA, but you still don't want to do it for long term. Like I would say, you don't want to do humic acid for more than like 8 weeks kind of time period. So fulvic acid in humans, I would say that because of the fact that it does absorb into the blood, and it doesn't know the difference between metals and minerals. It's great for bringing minerals into your cells, but we're not plants. Plant cells are better at distinguishing metals from minerals. Our cells are not that great at determining the difference between metals and minerals. So fulvic acid can bind both metals and minerals and bring them into our cells. So we want to be careful about that. I think that ultimately it's probably best to keep fulvic acid, at least large amounts of it, for the garden. The last main one that I want to talk about is shilajit, and then I have a few other cool things I want to talk about. I know it's almost 8 o'clock. So shilajit is another compound. It does contain small amounts of fulvic and humic acid, but it also has this molecule, dibenzo alpha pyrones, plus it has trace minerals, which is really, really good. And so what happens is this makes people feel really good because it has these molecules that act like electron carriers, and it helps your mitochondria so that you can make energy, which is ATP. So a lot of people feel really good taking this. Plus, it has some humic acid that's going to bind stuff in your gut. Okay. I want to just talk a little bit. I'm almost done. I want to talk a little bit about binders in general. Binders are things that are going to stay in the digestive tract and not go into your blood. These I like because you're not going to mobilize and redistribute things that are in your bones and your brain. They'll turn over naturally if you decrease exposure, then gradually, eventually, we always do detoxify. Our body knows how to deal with metals. The trick is to not be exposed to more than our body can deal with. So these things, we want the ideal time. If you're going to take a binder, you want to do it about 2 hours after you eat, and you don't want to take a binder anywhere near medication or supplements. So when you eat something, then your liver, especially if you have healthy fat in that meal, then the gallbladder is going to contract. The bile is going to go in the small intestine, where the liver put heavy metal waste. And now the binders can bind those toxins that your liver is trying to get rid of. Okay. So timing of taking binders is really important. So the best ones are bentonite clay, zeolite, apple pectin or citrus pectin. These are very mild. They're nice and they're really good for things like lead and mercury. Activated charcoal is actually more, not as much for metals. It's better for organic toxins. And if you have food poisoning or things like that, mycotoxins, some metals, but not really. So charcoal is more about you ate something bad or you drank water in Mexico. Humic acid is a really good binder. It's going to bind heavy metals plus pesticides and dioxins. And then chlorella is also good. A lot of people take chlorella. It's really weak, but it's still going to bind a little bit of stuff and it's still going to help you get rid of things. This is going to have the least effect on your minerals. So now also remember that all of these can also bind minerals. So you don't want to do it every day forever because you're going to become mineral deficient. So you have to balance the metals and the minerals. So pay attention to possible mineral deficiency symptoms. These are some of the main ones. So if you start using a chelator or binders, pay attention to how you feel. And again, remember, a lot of these symptoms can be for like a million reasons. But if these come about after you start detoxifying, then you may be becoming mineral deficient. So you have to pay attention to that. Loss of taste and smell is a very specific zinc issue. Muscle cramps is very specific to magnesium. Neuropathy is specific to copper. Muscle weakness, like bleh, your muscles just don't work anymore, can be about selenium. And so there's lots of different symptoms that can come about if you're getting rid of more minerals than metals. So you have to be careful about that. So how do we actually get rid of metals? So what can we do? So it depends on if your body burden is high, like occupational exposure, then I would do the chelating stuff like EDTA with medical supervision. If you don't know, if you're not a welder or working in a steel manufacturing plant or working with lead batteries, if you don't have an occupational exposure, you just have normal exposure, like you eat some rice and you have some fillings, then I would say you have low body burden. And then I would say the best thing to do would be to minimize your exposure. Some things you're going to be surprised about, I'll talk about. And then helping your natural detoxification processes because using strong chelators can be more detrimental. Okay. If who's at higher risk? So really the high risk people are going to be occupational or environmental exposure. So lead or nickel, cadmium, battery manufacturing, welding, smelting. If you're demolishing old buildings with lead paint and lead pipes, if you are in mining or steel, like if you make pressure treated wood. Like those are the things where you're going to have high exposure. Sometimes you have to consider where you're living. If you are near industrial plants or near mining or near areas where the groundwater is going to be contaminated, then you would also fall into the high risk category. Okay, so how can you know what your metal burden is? Can't we just go get a blood test and then know? Unfortunately, we can't just easily test. So the main ways that we would look, and I honestly, if you think that you have a lot of those symptoms, um, that I showed at the very beginning of lead and mercury and aluminum and like your brain and like all that kind of stuff is affected, I would do blood, hair, and a urine test. I would do all of them. And then you can kind of compare all of this information. So usually a blood test is not going to tell you too much unless you've had acute poisoning. So you were exposed to, lead or, mercury. I don't know, we ate a broken thermometer. Nobody's going to do that. But do you remember in the 70s playing with mercury? Anyway, it's probably not good. So hair analysis is definitely going to give you an idea of your ongoing exposure. So if you're like constantly exposed to things, then a hair analysis is going to tell you about that. And then the DMSA provoked urine test. This is not like I feel like a DMSA urine test can make you feel like you have way more of a toxin burden than you actually have, especially if you have really good functioning kidneys. So if you do this one, I would also do blood tests and look at your creatinine and your GFR to look at your kidney function. And then you can kind of look at the big picture. So the other thing to consider with hair analysis is that you can pick up metals from the environment. Okay, so especially if you dye your hair, if you are around air pollution, and mostly aluminum. Aluminum can sit on the surface of your hair just from walking around outside in air pollution. Same with cadmium. That can be just because it's on the surface of your hair. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's in your body. So all minerals and metals are going to circulate through your body. They're going to circulate through your blood, and they're going to come in contact with hair follicles, but hair follicles don't take up all metals and minerals equally. So some things are going to preferentially go to different tissues. Okay. So, wait, did I have another one? Oh, okay. No, I took it out. So it was becoming too much information. But there's going to be like maybe 1 to 5% of the lead in your body will show up in the hair. And all the rest of your lead is going to be in your bones. And so the hair might not show the actual amount of lead in your body. It might look low, but it's because it's not in your hair, it's in your bones. Okay. So some hair, like it gives you a general idea, but it's not going to be like 100% accurate. So just be aware that hair analysis is cool and it can give you a kind of idea, but different metals are going to go into hair in different proportions. Okay, so hair follicles will attract mercury, arsenic, and some lead and some cadmium, but it's definitely not reflecting what is stored in like your brain or your bones. You can look at the minerals in your hair, the ones that you can like pretty reliably get a good estimate about is magnesium, iron, zinc, copper, selenium, iodine, and manganese. Hair analysis is pretty good for that. So if you do a hair analysis, then whatever it tells you for those minerals, you can be pretty sure that's probably pretty close to accurate. But when it looks at calcium, potassium, sodium, phosphorus, chromium, nutritional kind, or molybdenum, then these aren't going to be super accurate about what's really in your body. Okay, so how do we get rid of these? The number one thing is to avoid exposure. So I have a few slides about where are we going to get these metals? Where do they come from? Why are they even in our body to begin with? So some things about lead, like you would think that, humans should know better by now. We don't use leaded gasoline and we don't use leaded paint. We probably don't have too many lead pipes anymore, but old buildings do. So if you live in an old building, make sure that your water pipes aren't lead. Think about your drinking water. It can be in the soil in different places. Different places are going to have more or less. Ceramics, old ceramics. So if you're like an antique collector, like old ceramic stuff is going to have lead, pottery glazes, batteries. If you work at or play at a shooting range. And then yellow coloring. So lead chromate. So if you buy turmeric powder, turmeric is an amazing root and very great antioxidant, unless you buy it from India, Bangladesh, or some other countries where they use lead chromate as a coloring. So be very careful about buying yellow spices, curry powders, right? So you want to just look at the ingredients and I would honestly just buy the actual turmeric root and shred it yourself. You could also just buy organic. It's less likely to have contamination. So that's yellow spices is something to think about that we might not think about. Mercury. So we have to think about our dental amalgams, but we also have to kind of weigh the pros and cons of having them removed. You need to get a professional that knows how to remove mercury fillings. And then large fish. So basically, tuna is probably the main source for most people. And then this is going to be the methyl mercury form, which is unfortunately, the terrible form that's more likely to accumulate in your brain. Now, I don't even want to eat tuna anymore. Skin lightening creams are really high in mercury, so be careful of those. Stay away from broken thermometers and fluorescent light bulbs. So, how does this get into the environment in the first place? It's mostly from burning coal. So, that's why it's in the ocean and that's why it's in fish. And then thimerosal, which is in vaccines, well, in multi-dose flu shot vaccines, this is the ethyl mercury form, which is actually less terrible than the methyl mercury tuna fish form. Eating tuna, that mercury takes longer to get out of your body than the ethyl mercury in a flu shot. It also depends on the age. So you don't want to be younger than 3, and you don't want to have a leaky blood-brain barrier. So there's all kinds of factors there to think about. So these are the fish we want to think about. These are going to have methyl mercury in some amount. The safest fish to eat, sardines, anchovies, wild salmon, herring, halibut, and lobster. Yay, lobster. And then ethyl mercury is thimerosal, which is really, it's not in other childhood vaccines anymore. It used to be in some other vaccines, but now it's just the multi-dose flu vaccine. You want to avoid that. Cadmium. So the main source of cadmium is cigarette smoking. This is the number one highest, most common source of cadmium for most people. It's also in industrial pollution, but also in fertilizer, which means that it can be in food. And so when you look at where does the phosphate come from, it comes from rocks. And so when they take phosphate from rocks, cadmium is also there. Cadmium is found with phosphorus. And so it's too expensive to refine the cadmium out of fertilizer. So it's part of it. So when they're putting phosphorus on our agricultural food crops, cadmium is also going to be there. And most likely, conventional food crops aren't you know, getting nice compost with humic acid and fulvic acid, right? So organic food is less likely to have as much fertilizer. Organic food is more likely to have more compost and organic matter that has humic acid and fulvic acid. So then those foods are less likely to have heavy metals like cadmium. So the foods that we would have to worry about the most would be wheat, rice, oats, barley, and sunflower seeds. And then seafood like oysters, mussels, scallops, crab, and squid are going to have high amounts of cadmium. So plants can't really tell the difference between cadmium and zinc. So humans will actually absorb more cadmium if we are calcium or zinc deficient. So another reason why we don't want to be mineral deficient because it actually can make you more susceptible to other metal issues. So arsenic. So arsenic, remember we have like the seafood arsenic is okay. We don't have to worry about the form of arsenic that's in seafood, but we do have to worry about the arsenic that is in contaminated water, rice products, pressure treated wood since before 2004. After 2004, they started using copper to make pressure treated wood. So an old deck or old, you don't want to use pressure treated wood anyways for things like garden boxes or anything where you're going to grow food. You just don't want to do that. Brown rice has significantly more arsenic than white rice. You can soak rice and you can remove the surface arsenic. Um, Juices, anything that's sprayed with pesticides, when they become juice, then the pesticide becomes more concentrated. So it's always better to just eat actual fruit. You know, some pesticides can be washed off. Some just end up inside the fruit anyways, especially soft fruits like blueberries and strawberries and grapes. You really want to get organic. Whereas if it's like an orange or a watermelon or a cantaloupe, then or a banana, then it doesn't really matter as much because you're peeling a big thick skin off of it. Aluminum. Aluminum, there is so much aluminum. Okay, so cookware. Cookware is probably the number one source. We don't want to cook on aluminum foil. Like you don't want to put food on tin foil. It's not tin foil anymore. Back in the day, we used to call it tin foil. So aluminum foil and then barbecue it because the aluminum is going to leach into the food. Baking powder contains aluminum. So what we can do to avoid this baking powder aluminum. So if you eat a lot of baked things, especially store-bought stuff, don't do that because then you're getting trans fats and all kinds of other toxins. But if you make your own baked things, you can use cream of tartar and baking soda instead of baking powder. So that's cool. Baking powder has aluminum in it. Cream of tartar and baking soda don't have aluminum. So there's all these little things. If you make anything that uses alum, sometimes when you're pickling or jarring, you use alum, that's aluminum. So don't use that. And then be careful of baking sheets and tin foil packages and all of that kind of stuff, especially if you're going to cook with acidic or salty foods. Nickel, the issue is mainly jewelry and stainless steel cookware, and only if you have an issue with a sensitivity with nickel. And then chromium, the bad chromium is usually only if you're like welding or there's contaminated water. And then also old leather. Tanning used to be done with chromium. So if you have old leather products, there might be some chromium there that you can absorb. So last couple of slides. Safest cookware is cast iron. We can absorb iron from the cast iron, but it's in a form that we can use. So it's okay. It's like a good kind of iron supplement. Porcelain enamel cast iron is also good. Pure ceramic, but not ceramic like that's old and not like you don't want to get like, some antique ceramic glazed clay pottery mug and put hot coffee in it, right? Old ceramic and glazed things are going to have toxins, but new pure ceramic is going to be good. There's no metal. Glass and Pyrex is really good. Stainless steel is good, but you want to make sure that it doesn't have nickel and aluminum. So don't buy cheap, crappy stainless steel because there'll be aluminum and nickel. And then titanium is like super expensive, but this would be the ideal cookware. If you have lots of dollars, then this would be the best. It's like non-stick naturally and is completely inert and there's no metal leaching and it would be really, really great. Copper. Some people use copper for cooking. Copper can be a problem. So copper is a nutritional mineral that we need to have, but we need to have it in the right form. So when we have copper with a 2+ charge, that is the form that we typically take as a supplement, but it's not just a free ion. We take it as like copper glycinate or copper sulfate. If you use a copper pan, you're going to get copper ions by itself, and then it's toxic. So I wouldn't use like even like the copper water bottles and all of that stuff because it's free copper ions. It's better to get copper from food or as a mineral like copper, glycinate. So free unbound copper can be toxic. And then you're going to have neurological issues. Copper affects your brain. Then I want to consider like a Berkey water filter. These are amazing. Berkey water filters are really, really good. They trap and remove all kinds of metals in your water, whether it's city water or well water. It's going to get rid of all of that stuff. You can get an extra filter that will get rid of fluoride and arsenic. And it can also remove pathogens, bacteria, viruses, pesticides, chlorides, bromides, PFAs. Like this is non-stick, anything non-stick and waterproof, all of those forever chemicals. So really you want to make sure that your water is really clean so that you don't have the metals in your body that you have to detoxify. And then lastly, my last slide, we want to support our natural detox pathways. And I've talked about these things before in other lectures, so I'm not going to go into detail. Just a quick review. Our liver, our gastrointestinal tract, kidneys, they're the main ways that we get rid of all kinds of toxins. Plus autophagy, we want to do a little bit of intermittent fasting. We can sweat out all kinds of toxins. Don't forget to shower after you're sweating so you rinse it off and you don't reabsorb it. And then movement. We need to move our blood, bring things to the liver and to the kidneys and through the lymphatic system.